Hello and welcome to another video. This video is jumping the queue of videos that I want to make. And the reason being is that I sat on this video for quite a long time because the family were iffing and butting if they were going to let me make the video about it. And I appreciate people who don't want me to make their videos, but it is nice when people trust me to do so. And we come to agreement that I can make this video if in no way do I pinpoint the house that it happened in or put any names in that can be linked back to them. And some people say, oh, but you know, all this, but I appreciate them letting me tell their story, and this does touch on some touchy subjects, and that is why they don't want it in there. So I'm going to tell the story in the format that I find the best to be able to do this and to stick by what I've agreed with them. And I hope you appreciate that, but it does allow me to tell their story. And it's quite a story, and quite a horrific story at that. So this is what I'm going to call the Rochford Poltergeist. But to be honest with you, the location where this happens isn't really that important. So what I've done, I've got some names that we're going to be using, and we're going to call them John and Alice, and the little boy that turns up we're going to call Simon. This is to make sure there's no links to the original family. So what we have Alice, who was born in 1965, and by 1985 she has just got married and are just about to move into their dream house. They've just given birth to a baby boy they've named Simon. Now, Johnny is a couple of years older than Alice and found himself in a good financial position to be able to buy this house. And Alice was absolutely looking forward to this, and this was a new adventure for her. She'd just become a new mum, and now she was into a new house. Now, for Alice, things hadn't always been easy in her life, and we're going to flip back to that later on. So you're going to hear the first part of the story, then we're going to jump back to Alice's childhood. But for now, we are in 1985 and the summer of 1985. They've just moved into the house and they're setting up the nursery, and everything is absolutely beautiful. Now, this is a new family. You know how it is when you're excited, you move into a new house and you've got a new child. No, everything is you just feel everything is come together and you're a complete family. John and Alice have put Simon to bed and they're sitting there in the living room. And do you remember the really old baby monitors? They were quite big and bulky, and there's no like vision or anything like that, and they just sat on the side of the unit and you could just hear crying through them, and they weren't great. And I know that locally around my area, that if somebody had a CB radio, they could often come through on the baby monitor, so keep that in mind for this part. They are sitting there watching TV, and through his baby monitor Alice could make out this tune. Now, this tune was from her childhood, and it actually put shivers through her body. And the tune is Seesaw Marjorie Door. But it sounds like it's been played on a little tinny instrument. But the reason why it made her go cold, and she told her husband this, that when she was a child, one evening, this little tin toy she had in her bedroom started to play that tune, and it frightened the life out of her. Now, again, remember I said that walkie-talkies back then would interfere with baby monitors. These baby monitors were the big ones. I think they were Fisher Price back then, that the only ones you could really get. And they could be interfered with other radios and all that around the area. So there is a chance that it was picking up on something outside. Unfortunately for Alice, this little tiny event seemed to trigger a lot of old recurring nightmares she used to have years ago. And she describes it in a certain way that I'm going to try and read to you now. I woke up and my husband was next to me. On the ceiling above me was the electric blue light that I've seen before. But again, in this blue light, there was black smoke wafting around, and I could make out a face in the black smoke. The face would come down out of the ceiling and shoot towards my face, and then I would really wake up in a cold sweat. So your typical night terror. Put it down to that. So these recurring nightmares started coming back to her. She goes on to say, over the next 6 months, the nightmares continued. Not that often, but at least about twice a week. It started to become a bit of a problem because I was just falling asleep, and then someone would wake up for a feed, and then I'd just nod off again and I'd start getting night terrors and wake back up. I was living my life with only about 20 minutes sleep a night. This went on for about a year. Then John noticed that Alice's behaviour seemed to change around the house. She'd become more nervous about things, and some of her actions were quite puzzling to him. She started locking the doors more, and every time he left the house, she would lock the door behind him, so she was always secure in that building. This was unlike Alice. She never used to be like this. She would often leave the front doors open in her old place and not even bother about checking if they were shut before she went to bed. And John would often have to get up and go down and shut the doors. So security was actually quite a new thing for her. But then some really strange things started to happen. John would come home from work and Alice would say that she's done his dinner and it was in the oven. He would go into the kitchen and his dinner was in the bin. This happened quite a few times. Alice would say that she definitely did not put his dinner in the bin, but he's thinking that Alice is lying and it was causing a little bit of friction between them, and John keeps saying that it's not his fault he's being held up coming home from work, but that is why he believes that she's putting it into the bin. On top of this, on a couple of occasions, John's come home to find broken washing up on the floor by the sink. And Alice would turn around and say that she was sitting in the living room and items would just fall off the sink and just smash. John wasn't really believing that, and again that was adding tension to the house. It's now Christmas time and it's time to put up the Christmas tree. John and Alice go out and buy a new tree. They decorate it, they put it up and it looks lovely. They're really happy with it. They go to bed, they wake up in the morning, they go downstairs and all the decorations are off the tree and they're on the floor. John straight away blames Alice for this. Alice is saying, this has nothing to do with me, I didn't do it. And John's like, there's no one else in the house that can do this, there's no other option, it had to be one of them too. They're both accusing each other of doing it and trying to make the other one thinking they're going mad. So again, adding more tension to the house. Then in the early hours of one morning, John wakes up and he feels as if he's been punched in the face. And he's grabbing his eye and he looks over. Alice isn't in the room. She's actually in with Simon and looking after him because he's woken up. But his eye is throbbing. He gets up and goes into the bathroom. He looks in the mirror and literally the eye is going blank as he's looking in the mirror. He goes into Alice and says, "Did you hit me when you got up?" And she goes, "No." John don't believe this and accuses Alice of hitting him. With all what's gone on, John goes and stays at his parents' for a few days. They overcome this. It doesn't last, it isn't terminal, but John doesn't really believe Alice and he thinks that because he didn't wake up and go to Simon, she turned around, lumped him while he was asleep, got up and went to Simon, and yeah, he woke up with a black eye. He puts it down to that. He goes and stays at the parents' house for a few days and he comes back and they carry on their relationship as normal. And it is normal. For the next few years, nothing else happens in that house. Then Simon turns 5. Now, the next part, Alice said that I'm not going to believe her. And people she's told don't believe her. But she says this is the truth. On Simon's 5th birthday, they're all sitting there in the house. They've got friends over. Alice is sitting there on the settee and Simon is by her side. The next thing people in that room know is that Alice is screaming and she has a fork in her leg. And it's quite deep in her leg. Alice turns around and says that Simon had done it. People in the house don't believe her because the fault is too deep. Alice's explanation to John, and she sits him down and goes, "Look, you're not going to believe me, but this is what happened." Alice says that she was sitting there on the chair quite comfortable and Simon was just playing around by her feet. When she felt very cold, she bent down to grab her cardigan, and when she sat back up in the chair, all her vision went very blue and she started seeing this smoke image again in front of her eyes, as if it was a nightmare, but this time she's actually completely awake and sitting in that chair. She looks down at Simon, and instead of Simon being there, she sees this, what she describes as a electric blue demon sitting there instead of Simon. This blue demon picks up the fork off the side and stabs it into Alice's leg. She lets out the scream, and the second she screams, she looks back down and it's just Simon sitting there. Now, nobody else witnessed Simon doing that with the kitchen fork, so nobody believes her, and everyone believes that Alice has done this herself. John had to take Alice to the hospital to get this treated, and there's quite an explanation at the hospital of what happened. But at the hospital, Alice turned around and said it was an accident and that she managed to do it herself, which raised some questions at the hospital, because who would stab themselves in the leg with a fork? They got back home and the rest of the family were leaving. They stayed there while she got sorted, and the atmosphere was quite tense. They went to bed and Alice is struggling to get asleep because of the pain in her leg. John is getting up and looking after Simon. As John comes back into the bedroom, he hears banging downstairs and he's wondering what it is. He goes downstairs, and standing in the living room, he's looking through to the kitchen. All the kitchen drawers and the kitchen cupboard doors are opening up and shutting and banging, and items are falling out of the cupboards. John runs in there and pushes the cupboard doors shut, and everything stops. He's sitting back in the kitchen, and the first thing he thinks of is that the house is haunted. He goes upstairs and he tells Alice what he has just seen. Alice isn't shocked by this. And he goes, "Look, you've got to come clean with me. Over the years I've known you, there's always been something that I feel you've not told me about you. And what's happened since we moved here is really getting to me. You need to tell me anything you haven't told me before." Alice agrees to tell him this event in her life that she feels is spiraling out of control. So in 1970, Alice is 5 years old, and they're travelling down the 127 heading towards Southend, when the car in front of them gets a blowout and it spins, and Alice's dad's car hits it, and both cars flip over and roll off the side of the road. Unfortunately, the people in the car in front pass away. Alice was taken to hospital. She was quite badly hurt, and during that period of time in hospital, she started getting night terrors. Now, these night terrors were of this blue light that would cover the whole ceiling, and then these circles of black smoke would mix in with the blue light and would form a face in the middle of the ceiling before that face would come down, and then two arms would come out of it and try to grab her in bed. Now, this happened in the hospital, and it happened at her own home, and this terrorised her for quite a few years. So much so that she was under a doctor. The doctor's trying to help her with these night terrors. Now, Alice would turn around and say that the face that she see was the man in the car that passed away. As far as I know, Alice didn't actually see anyone in that accident, but Alice gave a description of what this person looked like, and apparently it did line up to what this person looked like who had actually died in the accident. There's something else that Alice adds to this, and Alice and her family are still not sure this is accurate, but it's what they've worked out. When Alice was little, they had this little metal box that you'd wind up and it would play Seesaw Marjorie. No one in that house remembered that metal box being there before the accident. But the first time they notice it is when Alice comes back from the hospital and she has it with her. What they believe is that the police found this little metal box at the site of the accident and thought it was Alice's, and then put it in the hospital for Alice to take home, just believing they're doing a good thing. This little musical box would play that tune of a night time all by itself without being wound up. After a few times of this happening, Alice was getting quite freaked out and asked her mum and dad to remove it from her bedroom. They did. They put it downstairs in the living room. Again, during the night, this music box would go off. But Alice, even though she was upstairs in her bedroom, she said the sound of this little metal box playing that tune was so loud she put her hands over her ears to try and block out the sound. Eventually, her dad actually destroys the box in the back garden and puts it in the bin. And that was the end of that sound. She never heard that again. Until the day it came through on the baby monitor that gave her all these flashbacks and started off all the nightmares and the night terrors again for her. She was reliving that childhood trauma. That actually led her to seeing doctors and going to hospital and even staying over in hospital for tests for some time. So it had quite a profound effect on her life. Unfortunately, what happens next is quite disturbing, but not in a creepy type of way. The next day after the birthday party, the police knock on the door and they arrest John for hurting Alice. At the hospital, they believed that John had done that to Alice and jumped the gun a bit, because once they were in the police station, John was able to get people from the party and come down and say that John was nowhere near it, and they all backed up Alice's story that no one was around her apart from Simon. But it led to a lot of checks being done on that family, and I think we check things a lot more regular now. And no, our services, social services, are not perfect, but I do believe they're slightly better than they were back then. But they had to go through all that procedure of proving that they were doing nothing wrong. Over the next 6 weeks, Alice and John say the house becomes almost unlivable. Every time they're in that house, something is being moved about, something is banging, something is smashing in the kitchen, and their life is a disaster. John goes to the church. They're not religious people, and the first thing the church do is to come in and suggest a blessing on the house. Now, this is a brand new house. This was a newly built house. On that land, there's nothing there before. And this is where I don't believe the location has got anything to do with what is going on. I believe, and I'll say this now, I believe this is a entity that has attached itself to Alice and then is terrorising the family. And quite soon, the church think this as well. And they go through quite a number of vicars and priests coming into the house and doing blessings, but nothing is working in that house. Simon has continued to go to school, and one day Alice goes to pick Simon up and the police wait for her. And they take her into the room and they want her to explain why Simon has handprints on his legs. Alice has no explanation for this. But the handprints are quite weird, because they only have 3 finger marks around those ankles. And not like if you would actually grab somebody and you could really push hard and cause a bruise, you'd get all 5 fingers on there. But it becomes very, very clear that the police believe that John has done this to Simon. And they bring John in for questioning. And of course he denies everything. Simon is spoken to by professionals, and he tells them that a blue beast comes out into his bedroom at the night time and tries to drag him out of bed. Of course, people don't believe him about this at all, and they're thinking he's covering up for his dad. But Simon is adamant that this blue beast is doing it, and he draws these people a drawing of this beast. Alice says it's almost like the beast that she see, or this demon that she see, that stabbed the fork into her leg. Now, despite what Simon has told the people he's talking to, John is facing charges of doing something to his son. This ends up to probably one of the most bizarre things if it could be observed. John and Alice contact the bishops that have been helping with the house. The bishops come down to the police station and give a report to the police about what is going on in that house, and the entity that they believe is that is attached to Alice and causing these problems, and that has now spread to the house itself, and that is trying to latch on to Simon. Unbelievably, the police believe them. Now, I know that John Nash is going to watch this video. I'm not saying that this didn't happen. I will say now that John Nash explained to me that despite all what's happened at Wayne's, people still don't believe them. People still believe that they were responsible for any harm that come to Simon. But the bishops sorted things out with the police, and John was no longer under any suspicion, and nor was Alice. So, you know, the church do have a certain power where, you know, when it comes to the supernatural and all that, religion's been around a lot longer than what I have been, so I'm not going to judge, and we look into supernatural stuff all the time. It's an option. I'm not saying it's all plausible. It's an option. You know, I'm skeptic and all this sort of stuff, but this is what the bishop's done. But after that, and everyone returned home, after a few days, the bishops turned back up. They got permission to do an exorcism. The only problem was they didn't know who to do it on. They didn't know if this thing had attached to Alice or to Simon. So they'd done a different type of exorcism on the house. So they're trying to remove this demon from the house. And it didn't work. So, you know, cut it short, it didn't work. Things were still spiraling out of control. At one point, Alice got a glass of water out of the tap, and as she's walking back to the living room, the water started to boil in her hand and she dropped the glass. And she turned around and tells John what's just happened, and he goes over there and he can actually see steam coming out of the water that is on the floor. So there's other people backing up the evidence, and this becomes a little bit more important when you start getting friends seeing things happen in that house. So we're coming up to the next Christmas, and they've got friends coming over, and their friends walk in with a big tin of, remember the old Quality Street? The proper thick tins. No, the proper thick tins of Quality Street, not what you get now. They put it down on the side of the table. And they sit down and they're all chatting, they have a few drinks, and they start hearing this weird noise, this bubbling, popping noise. They look round and there is smoke coming out of the Quality Street tin, and it smells very, very sweet and sickly. Their friend who brought over the tin gets up and goes to open up the tin and burns his hands on the tin. But at the same time, the smoke is getting quite thick and the tin is starting to change shape, and they're quite worried it's going to explode. So John goes out, gets the oven gloves and manages to get the lid off the tin. Inside is just this black bubbly mess of all toffee and chocolate, all boiling up and coming over the top of the tin and going all over the worktop. John's friend thinks that he's put it down on top of a heated tabletop. I think they used to be like the old fondue tabletops, really popular back in sort of like the 70s and the 80s. I remember seeing one on Bullseye where you got the a nice little tabletop and part of it was heated. Their friend thinks he's put it on top of that, and John is saying no, none of it is heated, and he goes over there and shows them that this worktop isn't heated at all. So they're quite confused and puzzled by this, but John's friend turned around and said maybe it was a chemical reaction inside the tin. That doesn't happen. You know, I think we've all had Quality Street in our lives, and not once have one of those exploded in front of me. So although I can't eat Quality Street or roses now, I've got nut allergies. Back then, it wasn't all may contain. It was either, yes, this had nuts, no, this hasn't got nuts. Now it's all may contain. Once again, the family turned to the church and they called the vicar in, the local vicar. He comes in, he's sitting there. And while the vicar is there, something in that house changes. The temperature starts to rise and it gets very, very hot, very uncomfortably hot. So much so that, you know, the vicar is loosening his collar, they're taking jackets off and jumpers off, and, you know, they're getting very, very hot. The vicar turns around and says that he believes that this entity is in that room right now with them. As he says that, a item, and we don't know what item it was, flies across the room and strikes the vicar. At the same time, something hits Alice. John is the only one left standing. The vicar looks up to see John being pulled up by his legs and being flung across the floor. All of them are injured. The only person who isn't injured is Simon, who is sitting by the TV watching all this unfold, laughing. The vicar starts to believe that this entity had passed from Alice and now was in Simon. All these people are injured, and the vicar feels that it is his responsibility to end this and get this solved. The very next day, the vicar turns up with a very high bishop that is one of the experts to do exorcisms in Britain. And we're not going to use anything to identify people in this video, but you can probably look that up and work that out yourself. They do a complete exorcism in that house. During this time, both Alex and Simon show evidence that something is affecting them. Simon is crying. At one point, he starts shaking and is sick on the floor. Alice wets herself, and she said it was very uncomfortable and embarrassing. She wet herself, but at the same time felt that everything was going blue around her and all the room was turning blue, and she's thinking that she's going to have this manifesting of this demon appear in front of her, but it never happens. And then all of a sudden, as someone said, everything went peaceful. From that moment on, Alice, John and Simon had no other experiences of paranormal stuff happen in their house. They went on to live in the house for many years and a very, very happy marriage, and still happily married today. Unfortunately for John and Alice, over those years after all the events happened, the stigma of what had happened to Simon and to Alice in the leg, and people seeing the police turn up at the house and all this sort of stuff, did stick around them. And there's a lot of rumours and whispers in the area. Some people will call them like the Ex's house and all this sort of weird stuff, and the creepy couple and all that. So it got nasty, and some people still accuse John of being a wife beater. And they're the words that he used. I will use them as well. He was, to his face, he was accused of being a wife beater, even years after all this had ended. Anyway, that's about the end of this story. I want to thank the real John and Alice for letting me tell their story. I hope I've done it justice. I left the bits out that you didn't want me to add into it. And, thank you again so much. Other people, if you've got stories like this and things have happened to your family, I will do my best to keep all your names out of it and your locations out of it if you don't want it in there. I'm more than happy to look at your case, work with you, go over it. I've done some research for John and Alice, making sure that the house had no history underneath it, whatever was on there beforehand. I tried to research the car crash for them. I gave them a few names that may help. But yeah, again, I'm not going to say I hope you enjoyed this video. It's quite a hard video. The next video, or a video coming up, as I say to you, is even harder. And it is about children, I'll say that. But those cases are still very interesting and quite scary. The one that's coming up that is a bit like that is your good old proper ghost story. This is a traumatic poltergeist story that affected a lovely family. My voice is going. I think I'm getting a cold. But again, thank you for all your support you've given me. And yeah, I'll see you next video soon. Bye.